The winter rain had started before dawn. Not the soft kind that tapped gently against windows and disappeared by morning. This rain clung to the city like grief. It soaked through coats, turned roads into rivers of mud, and painted the sky over Blackmere in a permanent shade of sorrow. And inside the Ashbourne estate, Eleanor Vale stood silently near the kitchen hearth, with her hands buried in cold water, scrubbing plates that had belonged to her late mother. Again. "Careful with that one," her stepmother snapped from the dining room. "It's worth more than your future." The servants laughed quietly, not cruelly, not loudly, but in the way people laugh when they've watched someone be humiliated for so long that pity becomes entertainment. Eleanor lowered her eyes. "Yes, madam." At 22, she had learned the art of disappearing. Not because she wanted to, because survival required it. Her father had once been one of the most respected physicians in Blackmere. People used to stop him in the streets just to shake his hand. Wealthy families invited him to royal dinners. The newspapers called him the man who healed the forgotten. But after her mother died during a fever outbreak, something inside him collapsed. He remarried within a year, a woman named Vivian Ashbourne, beautiful, elegant, and utterly merciless. At first, Eleanor thought Vivian simply disliked her. Years later, she realized the truth. Vivian hated anything that reminded the household that another woman had once been loved here first. "Eleanor." She looked up immediately. "Yes, madam?" Vivian appeared in the doorway wearing emerald silk despite the early hour, diamonds glowing at her throat like frozen stars. "Lady Harrow and her sons are coming tonight." Eleanor nodded carefully. "I'll prepare the guest rooms." "You'll do more than that," Vivian said coldly. "You will stay upstairs and out of sight." Silence. Then her stepsister Clara smirked from behind the doorway. "Oh, mother, let her come downstairs," Clara said. The guests adore tragic entertainment. More laughter. Eleanor kept washing dishes. Vivian stepped closer. "You think I don't see the way you look at yourself in mirrors?" she whispered. "Still pretending someone might one day choose you." Eleanor's throat tightened. "No, madam." "Good," Vivian said softly. "Because no one will." The words landed harder because they were spoken gently. That was Vivian's gift. Cruelty without raised voices. The kind that crawled beneath skin and stayed there. And for a moment, Eleanor almost believed her. Almost. But later that evening, while the house prepared for guests and chandeliers filled the manor with gold light, Eleanor stood alone in the attic beside the tiny round window overlooking the city. Rain blurred the streets below. Somewhere in the distance, church bells echoed through Blackmere. She rested her forehead against the cold glass. Once, when she was 10, her mother had braided her hair beside this very window and whispered, "Love is not something you beg for, Ellie. The right people will see you before you ever have to ask." Back then, Eleanor believed her. Now she wasn't sure. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Soft, careful. She turned. Mrs. Whitmore, the elderly housekeeper, stepped inside carrying a tray with tea and bread. "You haven't eaten," the woman said quietly. Eleanor forced a smile. "I'm all right." "That's a lie." Mrs. Whitmore shut the door behind her. Unlike the others, she had known Eleanor's mother, which meant she still remembered what kindness looked like. The old woman sat beside her near the window. "They're talking about the Royal Charity Ball tonight," she said. Eleanor looked away immediately. "Oh, you used to love those stories." "That was years ago." Mrs. Whitmore studied her carefully. "You know," she said softly, "people are whispering that Prince Adrian may finally announce a bride before spring." Eleanor nearly laughed, not because it was funny, because the idea felt impossibly distant from her reality. Prince Adrian, the most sought-after man in the kingdom. Every paper in Blackmere printed stories about him. Some called him cold, others called him brilliant. Widowed noblewomen fought for invitations to events he attended. Daughters of aristocrats memorized his favorite books hoping to impress him. And Eleanor? She spent her mornings scrubbing floors. Mrs. Whitmore touched her hand gently. "You should have been at those balls years ago." Eleanor swallowed. Should have doesn't matter anymore. Before the older woman could respond, loud laughter echoed downstairs. The guests had arrived, and moments later, a scream followed, not playful, not dramatic, real. Mrs. Whitmore stood instantly. "What on earth?" another voice shouted downstairs. Then running footsteps. Eleanor rushed toward the attic door. By the time she reached the grand staircase, chaos had consumed the manor. Servants rushed through hallways. Guests gathered near the ballroom entrance. Someone was crying. And at the center of it all, Lord Harrow lay collapsed beside the fireplace, clutching his chest. "Move!" Eleanor shouted instinctively. The crowd froze. Vivian's face darkened immediately. "Eleanor, stay out of this." But Eleanor was already kneeling beside him. Her father's training had never truly left her. "His pulse is weak," she said quickly. "Help me loosen his collar." No one moved. The guests stared uncertainly. Then Eleanor looked directly at Clara. "You, bring hot water now." For the first time in years, her voice carried authority. Clara blinked and obeyed. Eleanor checked Lord Harrow's breathing, irregular, shallow. His lips had begun turning blue. "Has he complained about dizziness recently?" she asked. Lady Harrow nodded frantically. Yes, for weeks. And pain in the arm." "Yes." Eleanor inhaled sharply. She remembered this. Her father had treated dozens of cases like it before his health failed. "Sit him upright slowly," she instructed. The room obeyed her now, not because of her name, not because of status, because competence commands attention faster than wealth ever will. Minutes passed, tense, heavy. Then finally, Lord Harrow inhaled deeply. Color returned to his face. The ballroom erupted in relieved murmurs. Lady Harrow burst into tears. "Oh, thank God." Vivian stared at Eleanor in stunned silence, as if she had forgotten the girl existed beyond household labor. Lord Harrow looked up weakly. "You saved me." Eleanor stepped back immediately. "You should see a physician tomorrow." "But you knew exactly what to do." She lowered her gaze. "My father taught me." A strange silence settled over the room, because many of the older guests suddenly remembered who Eleanor's father used to be, the great Dr. Vale. And for the first time in years, people looked at her differently. Vivian noticed it immediately, which meant the punishment came later, much later, after midnight. The guests had gone. The chandeliers dimmed. Rain still battered the windows. Eleanor sat quietly in the kitchen, drying the last silver tray when Vivian entered without warning. The slap came so fast Eleanor barely saw it. Pain exploded across her cheek. "You embarrassed me tonight." Eleanor stared downward. "I was trying to help. You were trying to be seen." "That isn't true." Vivian grabbed her chin violently. "Girls like you should learn an important lesson early," she hissed. "The world only notices beautiful things." Eleanor's eyes burned, but she refused to cry. That seemed to anger Vivian more. "You think saving one old man changes anything?" her stepmother whispered. "Tomorrow they'll forget you again." Then she released her roughly. "Clean the ballroom before sunrise." The door slammed shut behind her. Silence returned, heavy, humiliating. Eleanor stood motionless for several seconds. Then finally, she sat slowly beside the kitchen table and cried. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough to release years of exhaustion from a heart that had carried too much for too long. Outside, thunder rolled across Blackmere, and somewhere far beyond the city, a royal carriage cut through the storm. Inside sat Prince Adrian Veilheart himself, dressed entirely in black, unreadable as ever. Across from him, his advisor Marcus folded another newspaper. "The rumors are worsening." Adrian stared out the rain-covered window. "I assumed they would. They're saying you refuse every proposal because you're still grieving." "That would make the public sentimental," Marcus sighed. "The council wants stability. A future queen would calm the kingdom." Adrian remained silent. At 32, he had become something of a national obsession. Too powerful, too wealthy, too distant. Women adored him because he never seemed impressed by anyone. But the truth was simpler. After losing his fiancée 3 years earlier during a carriage accident, something inside him had hardened, not broken. Hardened, and now every conversation about marriage felt transactional, predictable, artificial. Marcus leaned back carefully. "You know what people truly admire?" Adrian looked over. "Go on." "The fact that your late fiancé came from a common family." Silence. That part was true. Lady Isabel had not belonged to nobility. The public adored the story because it felt real. A prince choosing love instead of politics. Marcus continued carefully. "People are desperate for something genuine again." Adrian almost smiled at the irony. Genuine. The rarest thing in royal circles. The carriage slowed suddenly. Marcus frowned. "What now?" A guard appeared outside moments later. "Your Highness," he called, "the bridge ahead is flooded. We'll need shelter until morning." Adrian exhaled quietly. "Nearest estate? The Ashbourne Manor, sire." Marcus nodded. "That family hosts half the city anyway. They'll accommodate us." But Adrian's attention lingered elsewhere, because through the rain-streaked carriage window, he spotted something strange. A single candle flickering inside the upper attic window of the manor. And beside it, the silhouette of someone sitting alone, still, motionless. As though the storm outside had somehow entered the room with her. Back at the estate, Eleanor finished cleaning the ballroom near dawn. Her hands trembled from exhaustion. Candles had nearly burned out. The grand room looked beautiful again, as though nothing painful had happened there at all. Funny how quickly rich people erase discomfort. She gathered the final tray when sudden shouting erupted outside. Servants rushed past windows. Doors opened. Footsteps thundered through the manor. Eleanor frowned. What now? She moved toward the entrance hall carefully and froze. Because outside the estate, illuminated beneath torchlight and rain, stood the royal carriage. Every servant in the manor had fallen silent. Vivian herself nearly stumbled, rushing toward the door. Clara squealed in disbelief. "Oh my God!" Eleanor's heart pounded. Not from excitement, from instinct. Something about the moment felt dangerous, like standing at the edge of a cliff without realizing how close you are. The front doors swung open. Rain and cold air rushed inside. Then he stepped out, Prince Adrian. Tall, composed, dark coat soaked from the storm. The kind of face artists spent lifetimes trying to paint correctly. But it wasn't his appearance that silenced the room. It was the way he carried grief without hiding it. Like a man who had survived something enormous and simply kept walking afterward. Vivian immediately curtsied. "Your Highness, what an unexpected honor." Adrian nodded politely. "Our carriage requires temporary shelter." "Of course." The servant scrambled instantly. Clara adjusted her hair so quickly it looked painful. And Eleanor? She quietly stepped backward toward the shadows. But then, Adrian looked directly at her. Only for a second. Yet something strange happened. His expression changed. Not dramatically. Just enough to suggest recognition. Though they had never met. Eleanor lowered her gaze immediately. The prince continued inside. Marcus followed behind him, speaking with guards. The household exploded into preparation, fresh rooms, extra dinner, wine, music. Vivian transformed within seconds into the perfect hostess. But Eleanor noticed something else. Prince Adrian barely looked at Clara, or Vivian, or any of the guests now trying desperately to impress him. Instead, twice during dinner, his eyes drifted toward the servant doorway where Eleanor stood carrying trays. And each time he seemed thoughtful, not flirtatious, not fascinated. Thoughtful, as though trying to remember something. Hours later, after dinner ended and guests retired to rooms, Eleanor carried linens through the western corridor. The manor had finally quieted, until she turned a corner and nearly collided with him. The linens slipped from her arms. Prince Adrian caught them before they hit the floor. For a moment, neither spoke. Up close, he looked even more tired than the newspapers suggested. "You should be asleep," he said finally. His voice was calm. Low, human, not the polished performance nobles usually used. Eleanor quickly took the linens back. "I still have work to finish, Your Highness." His gaze lingered on her bruised cheek, the one Vivian had struck earlier. "You're injured." Her stomach tightened instantly. "It's nothing. That doesn't look like nothing." She looked away. And there it was again, that dangerous feeling. Because something about his attention felt sincere, which made it terrifying. People like him weren't supposed to notice people like her. That was how heartbreak began. "I should go," she whispered. But before she could move, Adrian spoke again. "You saved Lord Harrow tonight." Eleanor blinked. "The staff mentioned it." She swallowed. It wasn't important. He studied her quietly. Most important things happen when no one important is watching. The words hit harder than she expected. Because for years, Eleanor had lived as though she were invisible. And now suddenly, someone saw her. Not her dress, not her status, her. A distant clock chimed midnight. Neither moved. Then footsteps echoed from the staircase. Clara, immediately smiling too brightly. "There you are, Your Highness," she said sweetly. "Mother was wondering if you needed anything before bed." Adrian's expression cooled instantly. No, thank you. Clara barely acknowledged Eleanor. Why would she? To people like Clara, servants became part of the wallpaper eventually. The prince stepped back slightly. Good night, miss. He stopped. Eleanor realized suddenly he didn't know her name, and somehow that hurt more than it should have. Eleanor, she said softly. Something flickered in his expression. Then, good night, Eleanor. She walked away before her heartbeat betrayed her. But upstairs, standing alone beside her attic window later that night, Eleanor made a mistake. She let herself hope. Only for a moment, only briefly. But hope is dangerous for people who have spent years surviving disappointment. Because downstairs, Vivian stood in the dark corridor watching the prince's closed chamber door. And beside her, Clara whispered, "If he notices her again, we'll have a problem." Vivian's eyes hardened slowly. "No," she said coldly, "she will." The next morning, Blackmere woke to gossip. And gossip, Eleanor had learned, traveled faster than disease in wealthy circles. By sunrise, servants across the city were already whispering. The prince stayed at the Ashbourne estate. Lady Clara danced with him. He may be searching for a bride. By breakfast, the story had changed completely. The prince seemed captivated by Clara. The Ashbournes may soon become royal relatives. The prince smiled at her twice. Eleanor listened quietly from the kitchen while polishing silver trays. Funny how people create love stories from eye contact. Mrs. Whitmore stepped beside her carefully. "You should eat something. I'm not hungry. That's becoming a dangerous habit." Eleanor forced a faint smile. "I'll eat later." But the older woman's eyes softened with concern. Because Eleanor looked exhausted. Not physically, emotionally. There was a difference. The previous night kept replaying inside her mind. The hallway. The prince catching the linens before they fell. The way he'd said her name. Not carelessly. Not dismissively, as though it mattered. And that frightened her more than it should have. Because hope had ruined stronger women than her. Across the manor, Clara was already preparing for war. 3 maids hovered around her bedroom while she rejected dresses, one after another. "No, the blue makes me pale. Not that necklace." "Mother, do you think he prefers softer curls?" Vivian sat near the vanity watching calmly. "Men like Prince Adrian prefer elegance," she said. "Not desperation." Clara rolled her eyes. "Well, he certainly wasn't staring at the wallpaper last night." Vivian's expression darkened slightly. "No," she said carefully. "He was distracted. There was a difference." Clara paused. "You think he noticed her?" The room fell silent. Vivian stood slowly. "Men notice strange things when they're grieving. That doesn't answer the question." Vivian walked toward the window. Outside, rain still covered Blackmere in silver mist. Then finally, he noticed her, she admitted coldly. "Which means we end this before it grows into something inconvenient." Clara crossed her arms. "She's a servant. She's beautiful." The words landed sharply. Clara's face tightened instantly. Vivian continued. "And worse, she doesn't realize it." "Why is that worse?" "Because innocent women are dangerous. Men project fantasies onto them." Clara scoffed. "She owns 2 dresses, and yet your prince barely looked at you." Silence. Clara hated Eleanor for many reasons. But the worst one? Eleanor never competed. She never flirted. Never begged for attention. Which somehow made men notice her more. Downstairs, Eleanor finished arranging breakfast trays when the royal advisor Marcus entered the kitchen unexpectedly. Every servant froze. High-ranking nobles never entered servant quarters. Marcus removed his gloves slowly. "I'm looking for Miss Eleanor." She nearly dropped the tray. "I'm here, sir." His expression softened slightly. "His Highness requests your assistance." The entire kitchen went silent. Even the boiling kettle seemed to stop breathing. Eleanor blinked. "My assistance?" Marcus nodded. "One of the guards injured his arm during the storm." "Oh, relief. Of course, medical help." Nothing more. Mrs. Whitmore squeezed her hand subtly as Eleanor followed Marcus upstairs. Still, her pulse raced the entire walk. Not because she expected romance. Because powerful people changed ordinary lives without even realizing it. And Eleanor had survived too long to trust sudden kindness. The prince stood inside the library when she entered. Morning light poured through tall windows behind him. He looked different today. Less distant somehow, but more tired. The injured guard sat nearby, holding his arm stiffly. Adrian looked up as she entered. "Thank you for coming." Eleanor nodded carefully. You said someone was hurt? The prince gestured toward the guard. He fell during the crossing last night. She immediately knelt beside the injured man. Professional instinct took over quickly. Can you move your fingers? A little? Does this hurt? Yes. She examined the swelling gently. Not broken, she said after a moment, but badly strained. The guard exhaled in relief. Eleanor looked toward the shelf nearby. You'll need cold compresses for the swelling. Before she could move, Adrian himself retrieved the cloth and handed it to her. The gesture startled everyone in the room. Princes didn't fetch things, especially not for servants. But Adrian barely seemed aware of the reaction. He watched Eleanor carefully while she wrapped the arm. Efficient, focused, gentle. Marcus noticed it immediately, and so did Eleanor, which made her nervous. When the guard finally left, silence settled over the library. Dangerous silence. The kind that leaves room for truths people try avoiding. Eleanor stepped back. Is there anything else, Your Highness? Instead of answering immediately, Adrian studied her. You learned medicine from your father? Yes, the famous Dr. Vale. She lowered her gaze slightly. He was famous once. Adrian walked slowly toward the fireplace. I remember him. That surprised her. You do? When I was younger, he treated someone close to me. Eleanor frowned softly. My father rarely spoke about noble clients. That's because he treated people like human beings instead of status. The statement caught her off guard, especially coming from royalty. Adrian looked toward her again. Most physicians cared more about titles than suffering. My father didn't. No, Adrian said quietly. He didn't. Something shifted in the room then. Not romance. Recognition. Two people remembering a world that felt more honest than the one surrounding them now. But before Eleanor could speak, the library doors burst open. Clara, dressed beautifully despite the early hour. Oh, she exclaimed brightly. I didn't realize you were occupied. Her eyes flickered immediately toward Eleanor. Sharp. Suspicious. Adrian's expression cooled again. Was there something you needed? Clara smiled gracefully. Mother arranged a riding tour through the Western Gardens this afternoon. We hoped you might join us. A pause. Then Adrian answered politely. I appreciate the invitation. Not yes, not no. Just careful royal language. Clara ignored the hesitation. Wonderful. I'll inform Mother. Then she turned toward Eleanor with a smile so sweet it almost sounded cruel. You may leave now, Eleanor, bowed slightly and exited. But as she walked down the corridor, she heard something behind her. Adrian, speaking again. Miss Clara. Yes, that was unnecessary. Silence followed. Then Eleanor kept walking before she heard more. By afternoon, the manor had transformed into performance. Vivian ordered flowers placed everywhere. Musicians arrived. Servants polished silver that was already shining. Because when royalty entered your orbit, every wealthy family began acting like actors auditioning for destiny. Eleanor stayed mostly in the background, which suited her until Mrs. Whitmore appeared breathlessly outside the laundry room. Ellie, what happened? The older woman held up a cream-colored envelope sealed in gold wax. Eleanor froze. Royal wax. This was delivered for you. For me? Hands trembling slightly, Eleanor opened it. Inside was a formal invitation. Her eyes widened immediately. The Royal Winter Charity Ball hosted at Valemont Palace attendants requested Eleanor stared in disbelief. No, Mrs. Whitmore covered her mouth. Oh my heavens. At the bottom of the invitation sat a handwritten note. You once saved a man while everyone else stood frozen. The kingdom could use more people like that. A.V. her heartbeat stumbled. A.V. Adrian Valehart, the prince himself, Mrs. Whitmore looked near tears. Ellie. But Eleanor's joy vanished almost instantly, because another voice entered behind them. Cold, deadly. Vivian. What is that? Silence, Mrs. Whitmore hesitated. It's just. Vivian snatched the invitation before she finished. Her face drained of color reading it, then hardened, dangerously. No, Eleanor swallowed. It was addressed to me. Vivian looked at her with something close to hatred. You honestly believe you belong at a royal ball? I didn't ask for this, but you encouraged it. That isn't true. Vivian stepped closer. You think one moment of attention changes who you are? Eleanor's hands shook slightly. No. You are still the daughter nobody wanted. The words cut deep because part of Eleanor still feared they might be true. Vivian tore the invitation cleanly in half. Mrs. Whitmore gasped. Clara, standing silently behind the doorway, smiled faintly. Eleanor stared at the shredded paper falling slowly to the floor. Something inside her cracked then. Not loudly, quietly, like ice breaking beneath water. For years she had accepted humiliation because surviving mattered more than pride. But now she felt something unfamiliar, anger, real anger. She looked up slowly. That invitation was not yours to destroy. Vivian blinked. The room went still. Because Eleanor never fought back. Ever. Vivian recovered quickly. You will not embarrass this family. This family embarrasses itself. The sentence landed like thunder. Clara's eyes widened. Mrs. Whitmore nearly stopped breathing. And Vivian? Vivian slapped her again. Harder this time. But Eleanor didn't lower her gaze afterward. For the first time in years, she looked directly back. Vivian noticed it immediately, and suddenly understood something terrifying. The girl she spent years breaking was beginning to survive her. That night, Eleanor sat alone in the attic, unable to sleep. The torn invitation rested beside the candle. Rain tapped softly against the glass. Her cheeks still burned, but not as badly as the humiliation inside her chest. She shouldn't care. That's what she kept telling herself. People like Prince Adrian belonged to another universe entirely. This was temporary, meaningless. A passing curiosity. Yet, why had he invited her? Not Clara, not Vivian, her. A knock interrupted her thoughts. Soft, careful. She opened the attic door slowly and froze. Marcus stood there holding another envelope. The prince assumed something like this might happen, he said calmly. Eleanor blinked. What? Marcus handed her the letter. This one cannot be destroyed. Her fingers trembled opening it. Inside sat another invitation. And beneath it, a second handwritten note. If they refuse to let you enter through the front gate, arrive through the palace garden instead. Eleanor stared at the words. Heart racing. Marcus spoke quietly. His Highness rarely notices anyone. She looked up slowly. Why me? The advisor studied her for a long moment, then finally answered, because you look at suffering instead of away from it. He turned to leave, but paused near the staircase. One more thing, Miss Eleanor. Yes? The prince hasn't slept through a single night in 3 years. Silence. Then Marcus disappeared downstairs. Eleanor stood frozen in the attic doorway long after he left, because suddenly, this no longer felt like fantasy. Fantasy was easy. Fantasy was dancing and dresses and impossible romance. But pain recognizing pain? That felt dangerously real. Across the manor, Prince Adrian stood alone beside the fireplace in the library. Marcus entered quietly. She received the invitation. Adrian nodded once. And Vivian? Predictably cruel. A shadow crossed Adrian's expression. He looked into the fire for several seconds before speaking. I knew someone like her once. Marcus frowned slightly. The stepmother? No, Adrian said quietly. The girl. Silence filled the room. Marcus rarely heard him speak this personally anymore. Adrian continued softly. My fiancée used to look at people the same way. How? As though they mattered. The fire cracked gently. Outside, the storm finally began to calm. Marcus leaned carefully against the doorway. You know this becomes dangerous if the court notices. I know. Women will talk. They already do. The council wants political marriage. Adrian's voice hardened slightly. The council wants obedience. Marcus sighed. And what do you want? That question lingered, heavy, because Adrian himself no longer knew. For years, grief had made every future feel empty, predictable, colorless. Then suddenly, a girl covered in ash and rain revived a dying man while wealthy guests stood helpless around her. And for the first time in years, something felt alive again. Not love, not yet, but interest. Real interest, which frightened him more than he cared to admit. Meanwhile, downstairs in the servants' quarters, Clara confronted Vivian privately. You're letting this get too far. Vivian poured wine calmly. It's already under control. The prince invited her twice. He pities her. Men marry women they pity all the time. Vivian's expression sharpened instantly. Clara stepped closer. If she enters that palace, people will notice her. Vivian went silent. Because that part was true. And Vivian understood aristocratic society better than anyone. Beauty hidden inside poverty becomes irresistible to powerful men, especially wounded ones. Then suddenly Vivian smiled, slowly, coldly. I suppose, she murmured, we simply ensure she never reaches the palace at all. Clara frowned. What does that mean? Vivian looked toward the rain-covered windows. It means, she said softly, every girl eventually learns her place. Upstairs, Eleanor finally unfolded the second invitation again beneath candlelight. Her eyes lingered on the handwritten line. Arrive through the palace garden instead. And despite everything, a tiny dangerous feeling returned to life inside her chest. Hope, the kind that destroys people. Or saves them, sometimes both. The morning of the royal ball arrived beneath a sky the color of silver ash. Blackmere buzzed like a living thing. Carriages rolled through crowded streets. Flower vendors tripled their prices. Newspapers printed sketches of noble women expected to attend the palace that evening. And everywhere people whispered the same name. Prince Adrian Valahart. The prince may announce a future bride tonight. My cousin works in the palace kitchens. He says nobles from 3 kingdoms arrived yesterday. They say the prince hasn't danced since Lady Isabel died. Imagine being the woman he finally chooses. Inside the Ashbourne estate, chaos consumed every room. Servants rushed between hallways, carrying gowns, jewelry, and perfume trays, while Vivian supervised preparations like a military commander preparing for battle. Clara stood before 3 mirrors at once. No, not this necklace, she snapped. The emeralds look older under candlelight. A maid quickly replaced them with diamonds. Vivian adjusted Clara's sleeve carefully. Tonight matters, I know. No mistakes. Clara smirked faintly. He already notices me. Vivian's eyes hardened slightly. No, she said quietly. He notices possibility. That's different. Downstairs, Eleanor quietly folded linens near the servants' quarters, pretending the ball did not exist. Pretending her heart wasn't racing every time she thought about the invitation hidden beneath the floorboard in her attic room. Pretending she hadn't read Adrian's handwritten note nearly 20 times. Arrived through the palace garden instead. Mrs. Whitmore entered carrying a small wooden box. Without speaking, she placed it gently on the table. Eleanor frowned. What's this? Open it. Slowly, Eleanor lifted the lid and forgot how to breathe. Inside lay a gown, soft ivory silk, simple, elegant. Beautiful enough to make tears rise instantly to her eyes. No, Mrs. Whitmore smiled sadly. It belonged to your mother. Eleanor touched the fabric carefully, almost afraid it would disappear. I thought Vivian sold all her dresses. She sold most of them. The older woman hesitated. But your mother hid this one before she died. Eleanor's throat tightened painfully. She knew I'd need it someday. Mrs. Whitmore looked away. I think she hoped you would remember who you were. Silence filled the room. Then Eleanor whispered the question she had feared asking for years. Was my mother happy here? The old woman's eyes softened immediately. She was happy before grief entered this house. A long pause followed. Then quietly, your father adored her. Something inside Eleanor cracked again. Because children raised without love eventually begin believing they were born unworthy of it. But hearing that her mother had once been deeply loved somehow mattered. Mrs. Whitmore stepped closer. You should go tonight. Fear immediately replaced the warmth. I can't. Yes, you can. If Vivian finds out, she already punishes you for existing. The truth of that settled heavily between them. Eleanor looked back at the gown. What if I don't belong there? Mrs. Whitmore smiled gently. Most people at royal balls don't belong there emotionally. They just have expensive clothes. Despite herself, Eleanor laughed softly. A real laugh. Perhaps the first in months. And downstairs, hidden just beyond the doorway, someone heard it. Prince Adrian. He had arrived early to prepare for the evening ceremony. But now he stood motionless in the corridor, listening quietly to the sound. Her laugh surprised him, not because it was beautiful, because it sounded rare, like something unused for too long. Marcus approached beside him. You're staring again. Adrian looked away calmly. I was thinking. No, Marcus replied dryly. You were staring. Adrian ignored him. But internally, something unsettled him. For 3 years, every noblewoman he met behaved as though speaking to him were a performance. Carefully rehearsed smiles, calculated charm, strategic flirtation. Eleanor was different. She never tried to impress him. In fact, she spent most of her time trying not to be noticed at all, which only made him notice her more. That evening, the royal palace transformed into light.
If this story is touching your heart so far, take 1 second to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like Eleanor's remind us that sometimes the people treated as invisible are the ones worth the most. And trust me, what happens next will change everything.
Thousands of candles illuminated towering crystal chandeliers. Music drifted through marble halls. The wealthiest families in Blackmere arrived dressed in gold, silk, and diamonds bright enough to blind each other. Outside the grand entrance, reporters shouted questions while nobles stepped from carriages, pretending not to enjoy the attention. Inside, Clara Ashbourne entered the ballroom like a queen already claiming territory. Heads turned instantly. Her gown shimmered silver beneath candlelight. Vivian smiled with satisfaction. "This is your moment," she whispered. Clara scanned the room immediately, searching for Adrian, and there he was, near the royal staircase, dressed entirely in black once again. Every woman in the ballroom noticed him within seconds, but Adrian looked detached from the spectacle surrounding him, like a man attending his own portrait unveiling. Then suddenly, a palace servant approached him quietly, whispered something in his ear, and for the first time that evening, the prince's expression changed. Outside the palace gardens, Eleanor stood trembling beside the iron gate. The ivory gown fit perfectly. Her mother's pearl earrings caught the moonlight softly. Mrs. Whitmore had braided her hair carefully before she left. Yet despite everything, Eleanor still felt like an imposter. The palace loomed ahead like another world entirely. Music drifted faintly through open windows. Laughter echoed from distant balconies. She almost turned around 3 separate times. Then the gate opened. Marcus stood waiting. "You came?" Eleanor exhaled shakily. "Barely." His eyes softened slightly. "He's been watching the entrance hall for 20 minutes. Her pulse stumbled instantly. Marcus offered his arm politely. "Come before you lose courage." Inside the palace gardens, fountains shimmered beneath moonlight while nobles wandered among roses and lanterns. For a moment, Eleanor forgot to breathe. Everything looked unreal, not because of wealth, because it felt alive. Then suddenly, voices nearby. 2 noble women stood near the fountain whispering. "That's her? She's beautiful. She doesn't look noble." "No, but she looks like someone from a painting." Eleanor immediately lowered her gaze. Old instincts returned fast. Hide, disappear, avoid attention. But before fear consumed her completely, a voice spoke behind her. "You came." She turned slowly, and there he was, Adrian. For one suspended moment, neither moved. His eyes traveled across her face carefully, not hungrily, not possessively, almost stunned, because the girl covered in soot and servant linens had vanished. And somehow, the woman standing before him now looked exactly like someone fate had hidden too long. Eleanor's heartbeat thundered painfully. "You invited me." His mouth almost curved into a smile. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did." Around them, conversations began slowing. People were noticing. Fast. Clara noticed too. From across the ballroom, she watched Adrian descend the staircase toward Eleanor, and the color drained slowly from her face. No, Vivian followed her gaze, then went completely still, because the prince wasn't merely greeting Eleanor. He was looking at her the way powerful men look at women who genuinely interest them, which was far more dangerous. The orchestra suddenly shifted songs, a waltz, the first official dance of the evening. Every noble woman in the room subtly straightened, waiting, because traditionally, the prince's first dance meant something. Clara inhaled sharply as Adrian stepped forward, toward Eleanor. Then, he held out his hand. "May I?" The ballroom nearly stopped breathing. Eleanor stared at him in shock. "I don't know how to dance at royal courts." "Neither do most people here," he replied softly. "They simply memorize the steps." Despite the tension crushing her chest, she smiled faintly and placed her hand in his. The room exploded into whispers. "Oh my God, who is she?" "That's the Ashbourne stepdaughter." "The servant girl?" "No." "Yes." Clara's nails dug into her palms so hard they nearly broke skin. Vivian remained perfectly still, which was somehow worse. Meanwhile, Adrian guided Eleanor slowly onto the ballroom floor. Music swelled around them. Her hands trembled slightly. "I'm going to embarrass myself." "No," he said calmly. "You're going to survive 5 minutes of rich people staring." A surprised laugh escaped her again, and Adrian noticed instantly how different she became when she forgot to be afraid. The dance began. Slow, elegant. And for the first time in years, the prince looked genuinely present, not grieving, not distant, alive. Around them, nobles whispered viciously. She trapped him. She planned this. She's beneath him. Look how he watches her. But Adrian ignored every voice except hers. You seem uncomfortable, he observed quietly. I feel like everyone here wants me removed from the building. That feeling isn't entirely inaccurate. Eleanor nearly laughed again. Then her expression softened. Why are you doing this? The question lingered between them. Adrian answered honestly. Because you're the first person I've met in years who speaks like the world still matters. Her chest tightened painfully. No one had ever spoken to her that way before. Not as decoration, not as obligation, as someone worth listening to. Then suddenly, a voice interrupted sharply. Your Highness, they stopped dancing. A royal councilman stood nearby, looking visibly uncomfortable. The Queen Regent requests a private audience immediately. Adrian's expression cooled. Now, I'm afraid so. He looked back toward Eleanor. Something unreadable crossed his face. Wait for me. Before she could answer, he disappeared toward the upper corridors with the councilman. And immediately, the ballroom shifted. Without Adrian beside her, Eleanor became vulnerable again. Nobles stared openly now, some with curiosity, others with cruelty. Then Clara approached slowly, smiling, too sweetly. You clean up nicely, she said softly. Eleanor remained calm. Thank you. Clara circled slightly closer. You should leave before this becomes humiliating. Eleanor met her gaze carefully. I think humiliation stopped frightening me years ago. For a second, Clara's mask slipped. Pure resentment flashed beneath it. Then she smiled again. You know he's still in love with his dead fiancée, don't you? The words hit sharply. Clara continued gently. You're not special, Eleanor. You're simply convenient grief. That one hurt. Because part of Eleanor already feared it might be true. Before she could respond, Vivian appeared beside Clara. Enough, Vivian said coldly. But not to Clara, to Eleanor. Then Vivian leaned closer. You think tonight changes your life? Eleanor stayed silent. Vivian smiled faintly. Then perhaps you should know the truth about your father. Her stomach tightened instantly. What truth? Vivian's eyes glittered. The prince remembers your father, because your father once worked inside the palace. Eleanor frowned slightly. I know that. No, Vivian whispered. You don't. Then he was treating the prince's fiancée the night she died. The room tilted. Eleanor stared at her. What? Vivian watched the pain spread across her face with terrifying satisfaction. Your father failed to save the woman Prince Adrian loved. Everything inside Eleanor froze. No wonder Adrian remembered him. No wonder grief followed him like shadow. Her father had been there, the night everything broke. Vivian stepped even closer. Imagine how quickly this little fantasy ends once he remembers that. Eleanor couldn't breathe properly. Her father had spent years drowning himself in guilt after her mother died. But now suddenly, another possibility emerged. Another tragedy, another burden he carried silently. Vivian smiled softly. Some people destroy everything they touch. Then she walked away. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the ballroom while music continued around her. Voices blurred, lights blurred. Because suddenly she understood something horrifying. What if Adrian only noticed her because she reminded him of loss? What if every moment between them had been grief searching for familiarity? And worse, what if her family had already ruined his life once before? Upstairs, inside the royal council chamber, tension exploded. You danced with a servant in front of the entire court. One councilman snapped. Adrian remained calm. She is not a servant, she lives as one. Another councilman leaned forward. The kingdom requires stability, not emotional decisions. Adrian's patience thinned visibly. I chose a dance partner, not a constitutional crisis. You chose scandal. The Queen Regent finally spoke. Quiet, sharp, enough. The room fell silent immediately. She looked toward Adrian carefully. You truly favor this girl? Adrian hesitated, then answered honestly. I don't know yet. The Queen studied him for several seconds, then quietly asked, Does she make you forget your grief? Silence filled the chamber. Adrian looked away first, and that alone answered the question. Meanwhile, downstairs, Eleanor was gone. Marcus discovered it first. She left the ballroom. Adrian turned immediately. What? No one saw where. Something cold entered his chest instantly. Not fear. Worse. The feeling that something important was slipping away before he fully understood it. Outside the palace, snow had begun replacing rain. Eleanor walked quickly through the dark streets, fighting tears. Vivian's words echoed relentlessly. Your father failed to save the woman Prince Adrian loved. Every hopeful feeling she allowed herself now felt foolish. Of course, stories like this never end well. Princes did not fall in love with broken servant girls. Real life was not built that way, and grief makes people reach for familiar pain. That was all she was, a reminder, nothing more. Behind her, distant carriage wheels thundered suddenly through the snow. Then a voice shouted, "Eleanor!" She froze, slowly turned, and saw Prince Adrian stepping from the royal carriage into the falling snow. Breathing hard, looking genuinely panicked for the first time since she met him. He walked toward her quickly. "Why did you leave?" She tried to steady herself. "You should go back to the palace. Answer me." Pain finally cracked through her composure. "My father treated Lady Isabel." Adrian went still. Snow fell silently around them. Eleanor's voice trembled. "You knew the entire time?" "Yes." "And you still invited me?" "Yes." "Why?" The question broke between them. Raw. Human. Adrian looked at her for a long moment before answering. "Because grief recognizes people who understand it." Tears filled her eyes instantly. Not because the answer hurt, because it was honest. And honesty is devastating when you've spent years surviving lies. Snow fell quietly across Blackmere. The kind of snowfall that made the city look softer than it truly was. Street lanterns glowed gold against white-covered roads while distant church bells echoed through the cold night air. And in the middle of the empty street, Eleanor stood facing Prince Adrian with tears burning in her eyes. Because for the first time since meeting him, she was afraid to believe him. Grief recognizes people who understand it. His words still hung between them, painfully honest, dangerously human. Eleanor wrapped her arms tightly around herself against the cold. "You should told me." Adrian didn't argue. "I know. My father blamed himself for years after my mother died." Snow gathered slowly on his dark coat. "He blamed himself after Isabel, too." Eleanor looked away immediately. That hurt more than she expected, because suddenly she understood why her father had slowly disappeared emotionally after her mother's death. He wasn't carrying one grave, he was carrying two. Adrian stepped closer carefully. "Your father did everything possible to save her. But she still died." "Yes." The word landed heavily. No comforting lie, no polished reassurance, just truth. Eleanor shook her head slowly. "You invited me to the palace knowing all of this. I invited you because none of it was your fault." The simplicity of the sentence nearly broke her. People who grow up around cruelty begin apologizing for things they never caused. Their existence, their needs, their sadness. And Eleanor had spent years carrying shame that didn't belong to her. Adrian watched her quietly, then finally asked the question sitting between them since the palace ballroom. "Did Vivian tell you how Isabel died?" Eleanor frowned slightly. "No." A shadow crossed his face. "She was pregnant." The world seemed to stop. Snow drifted silently around them. Adrian looked away toward the dark city beyond the palace lights. "We were traveling back from the countryside after visiting a children's hospital outside Blackmere. The roads were flooded from rain." His voice remained calm, too calm. The kind of calm people use when they've repeated tragedy inside their minds thousands of times. The carriage overturned crossing a bridge. Eleanor's chest tightened painfully. She survived long enough to reach the palace infirmary. Adrian swallowed once. "Your father stayed awake for 22 hours trying to save both of them." Silence. "He failed," Adrian whispered, "and then spent the next decade punishing himself for it." Tears filled Eleanor's eyes instantly, because she suddenly remembered nights hearing her father crying quietly behind locked study doors after everyone slept. She remembered unopened medical journals gathering dust. The way he stopped looking directly at people, drinking the silence. Not weakness, guilt. All this time he had been drowning, and no one noticed. Adrian looked toward her again. "I hated him for a long time." The honesty stunned her. "But then one night," he continued quietly, "I found him sitting alone in the palace chapel." Snow melted against his hair slowly. He was apologizing to God. Eleanor covered her mouth. Adrian's voice lowered. He kept saying he should have died instead. A tear escaped down Eleanor's cheek, because suddenly her father no longer felt distant in her memories. He felt broken, human, real. Adrian stepped closer. That was the moment I realized grief had destroyed two men instead of one. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Eleanor whispered, "I think grief destroyed me too." Something changed in Adrian's expression then. Not pity, recognition. He understood exactly what she meant. The slow erosion, the loneliness, the exhaustion of surviving emotional winters no one else could see. And for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone inside it. Back at the palace, chaos had already begun spreading, because nobles love scandal more than kindness. Whispers traveled rapidly through the ballroom. The prince left the ceremony for her. She vanished crying. "Who exactly is that girl?" "She's connected to Lady Isabel somehow. No wonder he's obsessed." Clara stood near the staircase gripping a champagne glass so tightly it nearly shattered. Vivian remained composed beside her. But internally, panic had started creeping in, because this situation was no longer harmless curiosity. The prince had publicly chosen Eleanor over every noble woman in the kingdom, and now the court was emotionally invested. That made Eleanor dangerous. A palace servant suddenly approached Vivian quietly. "Lady Ashbourne? Yes? The Queen Regent requests your presence immediately." Vivian's stomach tightened. That was not good. Minutes later, Vivian entered the Queen Regent's private chamber with practiced elegance. The older woman sat beside the fire reading documents calmly. She did not smile, which terrified most people. "You requested me, Your Majesty?" The Queen looked up slowly. "I did." A long silence followed. "Then, you struck Eleanor Vale yesterday." Vivian's blood went cold. She recovered quickly. "I'm afraid I don't understand." The palace staff witnessed it. Silence. The Queen folded her hands carefully. "Do you know why I dislike cruelty, Lady Ashbourne?" Vivian remained perfectly still. "Because cruel people mistake power for superiority." The fire cracked softly behind them. The Queen's gaze sharpened, and eventually they become careless. Vivian's composure began slipping slightly. "With respect, Eleanor is emotionally unstable. She often exaggerates. She revived a dying man while your guests panicked." Silence. "She entered my palace tonight with more dignity than half the nobility combined." Vivian realized too late. This was not interrogation. It was judgment. The Queen stood slowly. "And unlike you," she added coldly, "she has never needed wealth to prove her value." Vivian's heartbeat thundered painfully. Then the Queen delivered the final blow. "Your invitations to royal functions are hereby suspended indefinitely." The words shattered everything. In Blackmere society, social exclusion was financial death. No royal invitations meant lost connections, lost influence, lost protection. Vivian's entire world depended on status, and suddenly it was collapsing. Meanwhile, across the city, Adrian and Eleanor sat quietly inside a small, late-night cafe near the river. The prince had insisted she warm herself before returning home. The old cafe owner nearly fainted recognizing him. Now, soft piano music drifted quietly through the nearly empty room, while snow covered the windows outside. Eleanor wrapped her hands around a cup of tea. "I haven't sat somewhere peaceful in years." Adrian studied her carefully. "That isn't normal." "No," she admitted softly. "It isn't." The cafe owner discreetly placed fresh pastries near them before hurrying away nervously. Eleanor smiled faintly. "He's terrified of you. He charged me double for tea." That surprised a laugh out of her again. And there it was, that sound, warm, alive. Adrian realized something unsettling then. He had begun anticipating her smiles, not because they entertained him, because they made the world feel less heavy. Eleanor looked down at the table quietly. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Why did you stop living after she died?" The question was direct, honest, and no one else would have dared ask it. Adrian stared into his untouched tea for several seconds, then answered truthfully. "Because surviving felt it disrespectful." Her chest tightened painfully. That sentence sounded too familiar. People carrying grief often punish themselves for moments of happiness, as though healing betrays the dead. Eleanor spoke softly. "My father did the same thing." Adrian looked toward her. "And you?" She hesitated, then finally whispered, "I think I stopped believing my life could become anything different." Silence settled gently between them. Not uncomfortable, just real. Adrian leaned back slightly. "When Isabel died, everyone expected me to recover quickly because I was royal. He smiled faintly without humor. People become deeply uncomfortable when powerful men remain visibly broken. Eleanor understood that immediately. Society worships strength, but real pain is inconvenient, messy, slow, and impossible to schedule politely. Adrian continued quietly. Then tonight I watched you walk into a ballroom full of people who spent years convincing you that you were nothing. His eyes met hers fully, and somehow you still remain kind. Emotion rose sharply in her throat, because no one had ever admired her survival before, only her obedience. Then suddenly, a voice interrupted from nearby. "Your Highness?" A young newspaper boy stood near the cafe entrance, nervously holding fresh print sheets. "You should see this?" Adrian frowned slightly and accepted the paper. Then his expression darkened instantly. Eleanor's stomach tightened. "What is it?" Slowly, Adrian handed her the newspaper, and her blood ran cold. Across the front page in massive black letters, "Royal Scandal. Mystery woman linked to dead fiancé captures prince's attention." Beneath the title sat an illustration of Eleanor entering the ballroom. And worse, a second headline below it. "Dr. Vale's daughter returns to the palace." Her hands began trembling. Adrian remained calm. "No, this is predictable. They'll destroy me." His gaze hardened slightly. "They'll try." Eleanor looked down again, fear slowly returning. Because this was the part stories never showed. Public humiliation, judgment, cruelty disguised as entertainment. Adrian watched the panic building inside her, then quietly said, "Look at me," she did. And for the first time since they met, he reached across the table and took her hand. Not dramatically, not possessively, gently, like someone holding something fragile after years of carrying sharp things alone. "You survived your family," he said softly. "You can survive strangers." The words shattered the last wall inside her. Tears filled her eyes instantly, not because she felt weak, because after years of emotional starvation, kindness felt overwhelming. Across the cafe, the old owner discreetly turned away, pretending not to notice. Some moments deserve privacy, even in public. Hours later, Adrian escorted Eleanor back toward the Ashbourne estate. The streets had gone quiet beneath the snowfall. For once, Blackmere looked peaceful. At the manor gates, Eleanor stopped walking. Fear returned immediately. "I have to go inside eventually." Adrian looked toward the dark estate. "No," he said calmly. "You don't." She blinked. "What?" "The Queen Regent has already arranged accommodations for you at the palace guest residence." Shock crossed her face. "She did what?" "You're not returning here." Emotion crashed through Eleanor so suddenly she couldn't speak. Because abused people often don't realize escape is possible until someone opens the door. And suddenly, the cage she survived inside her entire life no longer looked permanent. Adrian stepped closer carefully. "You deserved peace, Eleanor." The sentence nearly destroyed her composure entirely. She looked away quickly, trying to steady herself. But Adrian noticed anyway. Years of hidden pain. Years of being told she was unwanted. Years of shrinking herself so others could remain comfortable. And despite all of it, she still cared about people, still remained gentle, still survived. Adrian understood then that what drew him toward Eleanor wasn't beauty, though she possessed plenty of it. It was resilience without bitterness, one of the rarest things in the world. Inside the manor, Vivian discovered the royal suspension notice waiting on her desk. She read it once, twice, then slowly collapsed into the chair behind her. Clara stared in horror. "What does this mean?" Vivian looked pale. "It means we're finished." And for the first time in years, fear entered her voice. Real fear. Not for Eleanor, for herself. Because cruel people rarely imagine consequences until consequences arrive personally. Back outside the estate gates, snow continued falling softly around Adrian and Eleanor. Neither wanted the moment to end, because both understood something now. This connection between them had nothing to do with fantasy. It was not prince and servant, not power and poverty. It was two wounded people recognizing home inside each other's honesty. Adrian looked at her quietly. "Eleanor." "Yes?" The way he said her name now sounded different, warmer, certain. "I need to tell you something before you disappear into another palace hallway." Despite everything, she smiled softly. "What?" He hesitated only briefly. Then, finally, "When you walked into that ballroom tonight," snow drifted silently around them. For the first time since Isabel died, his voice lowered. I wanted to remain alive long enough to see what happened next. Eleanor's breath caught painfully, because she understood exactly how much truth that confession carried. And slowly, very slowly, hope stopped feeling dangerous. Instead, it began feeling possible. The palace bells rang in the distance. Midnight, a new day beginning. And beneath falling snow outside the home where Eleanor had once been told no one would ever choose her, someone finally did.
If you felt every emotion in Eleanor and Adrian's journey, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more unforgettable stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, at what moment did you realize Prince Adrian had truly fallen in love with her?